In 1996, during routine archaeological excavations at the historic fort of Jamestown, a team of researchers led by Dr. William Kelso stumbled upon an anomaly in the foundation structure of the Western Warehouse. The clay and brick in this sector had not simply eroded with time. They were saturated with a strange, oily substance that defied chemical analysis with the standard reagents of the time and had a viscous, resinous texture. Inside this isolated capsule, as if in a sarcophagus, an object was found whose existence completely rewrites the official history of the so-called time of famine. It was not just a book or a diary, but a thick ledger bound in rough, poorly tanned leather, which, as later DNA testing showed, belonged not to a pig or a cow, but to a creature from the primate family, which in itself made the lab technicians tremble. The pages of this document, filled with the neat handwriting of the colony's quartermaster, Percival Thorne, have become stuck together from the effects of organic fats, but modern spectral analysis has allowed us to reconstruct the text, which reveals a picture of a cold, mathematically precise nightmare. We are accustomed to thinking that the tragedy of Jamestown in the winter of 1609 was caused solely by hunger, disease, and conflicts with the Powhatan tribe. But the dry figures given in the discovered register paint a completely different picture, frightening in its impossibility. History claims that of the 500 people who inhabited the colony at the beginning of winter, only 60 survived until spring, and the remaining 440 unfortunates died of exhaustion. But the mathematics of death recorded by Thorne comes into sharp contradiction with the laws of physiology and thermodynamics. Calculations show that the food supply, even taking into account rats, snakes, and boiled leather, should have been enough to support at least 200 people under strict rationing. But people were disappearing at such a rate as if the colony had become a hunting ground for a predator whose metabolism required colossal amounts of biomass. Thorne's register contains alarming discrepancies between the weight of rations issued and the rate of population decline. And these data suggest that settlers weren't simply dying. They were being removed from their habitat by someone or something with the ability to penetrate locked spaces and vanish into the freezing air. To understand the nature of this horror, we must travel back to November 1609, when the clouds of the Little Ice Age gathered over Virginia, turning the new land into an icy trap from which there was no escape. The air became so thick and cold that every breath burned the lungs, and the humidity, penetrating through the cracks in the walls of the hastily built barracks, caused clothes to rot right on the bodies of still living people. The Jamestown colony, wedged between an icy river and a wall of endless hostile forest, was the perfect petri dish for the development of social and biological pathology, where hunger became the catalyst for awakening ancient instincts. Official reports of the era speak of severe tests of faith, but the discovered register of Quartermaster Thorne is devoid of religious pathos. It is a cold chronicle of dwindling resources, where human life is gradually transformed from a divine gift into a unit of caloric value. Percival Thorne was a man of numbers, a former logistician for a trading company who was accustomed to believing only what could be weighed, measured, and recorded in a ledger. So his testimony has a frightening credibility. He began keeping his notes at the moment when it became clear that the supply flotilla, on which all hopes had been pinned, had been scattered by a storm, and the colony was left alone to face the approaching winter. The first pages of the register are filled with routine data on the distribution of crackers, corned beef, and corn. But even in these dry lines, one can sense the growing anxiety of a man who sees the numbers in the balance column rapidly approaching zero. Thorne meticulously recorded every ounce of grain issued, every barrel of rotten water, trying to build a system of survival. But the chaos that began to penetrate the colony defied logical understanding. The strangeness began not with the disappearance of people, but with an anomalous change in the environment, which Thorne noted in the notes section with the meticulousness of a scientist confronted with an unknown physical phenomenon. He wrote that the forest around the fort had fallen silent, but it was not the natural winter silence when nature falls asleep under the snow, but the tense stillness that occurs when an ecosystem's top food chain emerges, overwhelming all other inhabitants. The birds that usually nested in the crowns of the ancient pines were the first to disappear, as if sensing an invisible threat. And the small rodents that usually infested the grain warehouses followed suit. This was the first violation of logic, because in times of famine, rodents should have become the scourge of supplies. But the warehouses stood untouched by rats, and this frightened Thorne more than the food shortage itself. In an entry for November 12th, the quartermaster notes that the sentries on the walls began to complain of a strange smell that was carried by the wind from the northern marshes, a smell that was not like the usual stench of decay or burning. Thorne describes it as a mixture of ozone, which is found in the air before a severe thunderstorm, and a sickly sweet musk scent that makes people feel nauseous and irrationally aggressive. This chemical marker, as we now understand, was nothing more than the pheromones of a predator marking its territory, preparing it for a hunt. But for people of the 17th century, it was the breath of the devil himself. The smell penetrated the walls, permeated clothes and food, changing the taste of water and bread, making them bitter and disgusting, as if nature itself was rejecting people's attempts to satisfy their hunger. The first unexplained death recorded in the register occurred on November 17th, and it immediately stood out from the general statistics of deaths from disease and exhaustion, which was scrupulously kept by the local surgeon. The victim was a young carpenter named Thomas Collier, a strong man who, despite meagre rations, remained physically active and was busy strengthening the palisade on the north wall. According to Thorne's account, Collier did not die in the infirmary or fall victim to an Indian arrow. He simply disappeared during his night shift, leaving behind only a musket leaning against the wall and a puddle of strange, viscous liquid that did not freeze in the cold. The quartermaster noted that there were no signs of a struggle at the scene of the disappearance, no blood, and, most frighteningly, in the fresh snow that had fallen an hour before the incident, there were no tracks leading from the wall into the forest. It seemed as if the carpenter had simply been erased from reality, or lifted into the air by an unknown force that defied the laws of gravity. This entry in the register is accompanied by a note, written in a shaky hand, in which Thorne, for the first time, allows himself to express emotion beyond the bounds of his job description. He writes that the weight of the missing collier, which was about 160 pounds, should be written off from the allowance, but his hand trembled when he wrote out the figures, because logic told him that such a disappearance was impossible. A person cannot disappear, and a wolf or a bear cannot drag away a grown man without noise and traces of blood, leaving his weapons in perfect order. This event became the turning point, after which the mathematics of survival in Jamestown began to distort, turning into a chronicle of absurdity and horror. The following weeks brought more disappearances, each accompanied by details that made Thorne doubt his own sanity and the reality of what was happening around him. People disappeared from locked barracks, from a hospital full of sick people, and even from a punishment cell where those caught stealing food were kept. The quartermaster noted with horror that the locks and bolts remained intact. The windows were shuttered from the inside, but people disappeared, as if seeping through cracks in the floor. The registry includes entries about strange sounds that survivors heard at night, sounds reminiscent of the crunch of breaking branches and wet slurping sounds coming from the roofs of buildings. Thorne, being a man of science and rationalism, tried to find an explanation in mass psychosis or conspiracy among the colonists, suggesting that a group of renegades was killing the weak and hiding the bodies in order to take possession of their rations. He began conducting nightly inspections, checking the lists of the living and counting supplies with maniacal precision. But each time, the numbers did not add up. The amount of food consumed was decreasing more slowly than the number of people, and this meant that someone or something inside the fort's perimeter was not eating government grain, but something else. In one entry, dated early December, Thorne makes a horrific discovery. The supply of salted pork stored in the most secure basement remained untouched, even though it was documented to be issued regularly. This meant that the entries in other books were falsified, or worse, that the people responsible for distributing food had found an alternative source of food that they were afraid to speak about out loud. The cold grew stronger, and the walls of the fort became covered with frost from the inside, turning the dwellings into icy crypts where the breath of the sleeping people settled as snow on their faces. Thorne's register increasingly includes references to thermal anomalies. In some parts of the camp, the temperature dropped so sharply that water in mugs froze within seconds, while in other areas, an unnatural warmth emanating from the ground was felt. The quartermaster describes an incident where a group of soldiers, returning from the forest, reported seeing steam rising from the ground in the deep thicket, as if a gigantic furnace were working there, or a huge creature was breathing under the roots of the trees. What frightened these soldiers was not the cold or the Indians, but the feeling that the forest was watching them with thousands of eyes, and that the very geometry of the trees changed when no one was looking. The entry from December 10th contains a detailed description of the incident that finally destroyed Thorne's faith in the possibility of a rational explanation for what was happening. That night, it wasn't just one man who disappeared, but a whole group of 3 watchmen who were stationed on the southern tower, which had the best view of the river. Thorne personally climbed the tower to inspect the scene and discovered a painting there that defied all laws of physics and biology. The sentries' weapons lay on the floor, loaded and ready for battle, but the men themselves had disappeared, leaving behind only their clothes. The waistcoats, trousers and boots had not simply been removed, they had been turned inside out and thrown in a heap, as if the bodies inside them had simply shrunk and flowed out, or had been sucked out by some unknown force. But the most terrifying detail Thorne recorded were marks on the outside of the tower's log wall, 30 feet above the ground. The deep furrows that cut through the hard oak wood resembled the claw marks of a giant beast, but the distance between them suggested that the arm or paw of this creature was twice as long as a human's, and the force with which the blows were delivered was capable of crumbling the wood like dry reeds. Thorne performed calculations to determine the force required to make such marks, and concluded that no known North American animal was capable of such a feat. A bear cannot climb a sheer wall with such agility, and a puma does not have enough mass to break through logs. This discovery forced the quartermaster to re-examine all the previous disappearances and look at them from a new angle. He began to understand that the colony was facing not starvation or an enemy tribe, but a biological species that saw humans not as enemies, but as food that could be harvested for future use. The term X factor appears in his notes, denoting an unknown variable that wreaks havoc on the survival equation. And this variable became more aggressive with each passing day. By mid-December, the colony's population had dwindled to 200, but food supplies were dwindling even faster, and Thorne realized with horror that food theft had become systematic. Someone was breaking into the warehouses, ignoring the locks and security, and carrying out sacks of grain, but leaving no traces on the flour scattered on the floor specifically to identify the thieves. This suggested that the abductor could move along walls or ceilings, or had the ability to change his physical form, slipping through the smallest openings. The psychological state of the colonists reached a critical point. People stopped talking to each other, afraid that their neighbor might turn out to be the monster, or that the sound of a voice would attract the attention of someone hiding in the darkness. The eyes of the survivors showed an animal fear that suppressed all human emotions, leaving only the instinct of self-preservation, forcing them to barricade doors and sleep with knives in their hands. The entries in the register become increasingly abrupt and nervous, and Thorne's handwriting changes, becoming angular and jerky, as if he were writing in a state of extreme excitement or chills. He begins to record not only the facts, but also his feelings, describing the constant cold that settled inside him and the hunger that could not be satisfied even with a double portion of rations. This was not the ordinary hunger of an empty stomach, but a deep, cellular thirst that demanded something more than bread and corned beef. Thorne caught himself with horror, thinking that the smell of living people with whom he worked side by side was beginning to seem appetizing to him, causing profuse salivation. He chalked it up to madness brought on by isolation and stress. But somewhere deep down, he knew it was the beginning of an irreversible transformation that was affecting not only his mind, but his body as well. One of the last pages of the first part of the register is devoted to the analysis of a strange incident with horses. There were only 6 horses left in the colony, which were being treasured for the spring work. But one night they all went berserk, starting to fight in their stalls with such force that they broke their legs and smashed their heads against the wooden partitions. Thorn, who had come running to the noise with the groom, saw a scene of complete chaos. The animals, usually calm and obedient, were in a state of wild panic. Their eyes were bulging from their sockets, and foam was coming out of their mouths. But that wasn't the worst thing. One of the horses, already dead, had a huge lacerated wound on its side, from which pieces of flesh had been torn out along with ribs. The wound was smoking in the cold, and its edges were not smooth like from a knife, but jagged, as if the flesh had been torn off with a blunt instrument or teeth. There was no one else in the stable, the doors were locked, and there was not a single footprint in the snow around the building. Thorn performed an autopsy on the horse on the spot to determine the cause of death, and discovered that the animal's heart had burst from an overwhelming surge of adrenaline. The horses died of fear, seeing something so terrible in front of them that their nervous system could not withstand the strain. But what could have entered the locked stable and inflicted such injuries without being seen? The answer to this question lay beyond the comprehension of a 17th century man, but Thorn, true to his habit of analysing everything, wrote in the register, "We are dealing with a predator that does not obey the laws of matter, or we are all going mad and killing ourselves with our own nightmares." At that moment, he still did not know how close he was to the truth, and that nightmares have a completely material, biological nature. As we wrap up our review of the first part of this horrific document, we should note a mathematical anomaly that Thorn identified in the December summary table. Adding up the weight of meat consumed, he was horrified to discover that the colonists had eaten 300 pounds more protein than was available in the warehouses and from slaughtered cattle. Where did this extra meat come from? Who or what provided these calories that allowed some of the colonists to survive the coldest weeks? The answer to that question lies hidden in the following pages of the register, but the numbers already begin to whisper a terrible truth. Cannibalism in Jamestown began not as an act of desperation by crazed people, but as part of a complex and cruel plan imposed from without by a being who was teaching his flock new rules of survival. Percival Thorne's mathematics of death do not lie. By Christmas 1609, the people in the fort were already eating each other without even realizing it. Or they were eating what was put in front of them by a caring shepherd, fattening his flock before the final slaughter. The year January 1610, New Style, is marked in Percival Thorne's notes not with ink, but with brown stains, the chemical composition of which unmistakably indicates a mixture of human blood and rust, which in itself serves as a grim preface to the events of those days. If the first part of the register was a chronicle of resource depletion, the second becomes a clinical description of the disintegration of human biology under the influence of an environment that has become completely hostile to any carbon-based life form. To understand the context in which the survivors found themselves, we need to cast aside romantic notions of the colonists as dashing pioneers in starched collars and look at them through the prism of forensic anthropology. They were no longer people in the conventional sense, but walking corpses functioning solely on the remnants of neurochemical reactions. The survival strategy in Jamestown had by this point shifted from build and settle to a primitive keep body heat at all costs. And it was in this state of extreme physiological exhaustion that they encountered a phenomenon Thorne described as atmospheric vacuum. The register contains a detailed account of a foray by a party of 12 men under Captain George Percy, undertaken in a desperate attempt to find game or roots in the forest, which they thought would provide them with food, but which instead became their prison. Thorne's description of the state of this detachment before their departure is physically repulsive. He writes not of soldiers of the crown, but of biological constructs on the verge of disintegration, whose gums bled so much from scurvy that they could not even chew the soaked leather of their belts. Their muskets, once the pride of English gunsmithing, were now useless pieces of rusty iron, carried more out of habit than real necessity, as most no longer had the strength to lift the heavy barrel to shoulder height and hold it long enough to aim. The clothing of these people was a grotesque mosaic of rags, pieces of canvas, and the skins of dead animals, which were swarming with lice, but the settlers no longer felt the bites, as their nerve endings had atrophied from the constant cold, turning their skin into an insensitive shell. Thorne records that before the detachment's departure, the air temperature dropped to values that could not be measured with the available instruments, since the mercury in the thermometers simply compressed into a solid ball at the bottom of the flask, which, according to modern reconstructions, corresponds to -30 degrees Celsius. It wasn't just winter cold, it was a thermal anomaly of the Little Ice Age, when moist air from the Atlantic collided with the Arctic front, creating conditions that instantly froze everything. The quartermaster describes how birds attempting to cross the fort's perimeter dropped dead in mid-flight, turning to icy stones before they even hit the ground. And that sound, the dull thud of frozen bodies on frozen clay, became the only music of that morning. The forest surrounding Jamestown had changed visually. The trees did not bend in the wind. They stood motionless, as if carved from crystal, and any sharp gust of wind caused the cascade of branches to break, which snapped with a deafening crack, reminiscent of a rifle cannonade. When the squad crossed the notional boundary of the dead zone, located about a mile from the stockade, they entered a space where the usual physical laws of acoustics ceased to apply, creating the effect of complete sensory deprivation. Thorne recorded the testimony of the only person to return from this expedition, who claimed that the forest was not just silent, it was turned off, as if someone had covered the world with a giant glass bell jar, pumping out all the air capable of carrying sound waves. The people's footsteps did not creak in the deep snow. Their voices sounded muffled and flat, as if they were talking with their mouths stuffed with cotton wool. And this acoustic distortion caused panic even in veterans accustomed to the roar of artillery. It was not the silence of the absence of life, but the silence of a lurking predator that suppressed all other sounds with its presence, causing the biosphere to freeze in terror before the top of the food chain. Nature's reaction to the presence of the X factor in the forest was so anomalous that Thorne devoted a separate page to it, attempting to systematize the scouts' observations and find a rational grain in them. Usually, even in the harshest winter, the forest is full of hidden life. The tracks of hares, the droppings of moose, the rustling of squirrels in hollows. All these are signs of a healthy ecosystem struggling for survival. But here, within a 5-mile radius of the fort, the forest was as sterile as an operating room, devoid not only of large animals, but also of the insects that usually spend the winter under the bark of trees. The scout described how they tried to cut dead wood for a fire and discovered that the wood inside was grey and crumbly, as if all the juices had been sucked out of it, and under the bark, instead of dormant larvae, there was only dry dust and strange cobwebs that crumbled at the touch. It seemed as if the very presence of this creature in the region caused the necrosis of flora and fauna, turning the living forest into a decoration behind which hid emptiness. But the most terrifying marker indicating the monster's proximity was the smell that began to haunt the squad as soon as they went deep into the thicket to within cannon range. Thorne, from the survivor's account, describes this olfactory shock as a complex chemical composition that could not have arisen naturally in the winter forest. The first note was the sharp, suffocating smell of sulfur and burnt gunpowder, which the soldiers at first took for a sign of a nearby camp of Spaniards or Indians using firearms. However, mixed with this mineral aroma was a second, more nauseating component: the sweetish, sticky smell of rotting fruit and musk that is found in the lair of a large animal during the mating season. The mixture caused stomach cramps and dizziness in people and acted as an alarm signal on the subcortex, causing the hair on the body to stand on end, even under layers of dirty clothes. These were the pheromones of a creature whose metabolism was tuned to digesting high-calorie prey, and the scent permeated the air, settling as a greasy film on the lips and tongue. The psychological state of the detachment at this moment passed from the phase of professional alertness to the phase of animal terror, which cannot be controlled by willpower or military discipline. People who had been through the wars in Flanders and Ireland began to behave irrationally. They stopped, peered into the void between the trees, and claimed to see movement where there could be none. One of the soldiers, an experienced tracker named John Ratcliffe, suddenly began tearing off his gloves, muttering that his hands were burning, although they were white with frostbite. Thorne speculates in his notes that the predator's scent contained a neurotoxin or hallucinogen that affected the people's tired brains, causing sensory distortions and paranoia. They marched in tight formation, back to back. Muskets pointed in all directions, but they felt naked and defenseless, realizing that their weapons were useless against something that could dissolve in the shadows and change the density of the air. The culmination of this foray into the atmospheric vacuum was the discovery of a strange find, which finally broke the spirit of the squad and forced them to turn back, abandoning all hope of obtaining food. In a small clearing surrounded by a ring of ancient pines, they found a tree that looked as if it had been struck by lightning. But upon closer inspection, it turned out that the trunk had been split by mechanical action from the inside. The wood had been torn outward in huge splinters, and in the center of this fissure, at the height of a man's growth, a lump of strange, bioluminescent substance pulsated, which did not freeze at -30. This substance emitted the same smell of sulfur and rot, but in a concentration that made people's noses bleed. It was a territorial marker, a biological beacon left by the Wendigo to mark the boundaries of its territory, and its glow in the twilight of the polar night hypnotized the exhausted people, beckoning them to come closer and touch this forbidden flesh of the forest. Thorne ends his description of this episode with a conclusion that sounds like a verdict on the entire expedition. We entered this forest as masters, with weapons and the right of the strong, but we returned like frightened children who looked into their parents' bedroom and saw something there that forever deprived them of sleep. We realized that hunger was not the worst thing that awaited us in Jamestown. What's scarier is that hunger has a mind, a shape, and a smell, and it watches us, choosing who to take next. This entry is dated January 20th, the day before the real hell began in the colony, and the first cases of cannibalism were officially documented as a necessary measure, although in fact it was a sacrifice to the new god, whose altar was located there, in the icy void of the dead forest. The atmospheric vacuum did its job. It isolated the victims from reality, deprived them of hope, and set the stage for the appearance of the main character of this tragedy. February 1610 brought with it a discovery that moved the colonists' horror from the realm of mystical fears into the realm of cold, nauseating reality, which, unfortunately, lends itself to physical description. Until this point, the Jamestowners could console themselves with the thought that their companions had simply gotten lost in a snowstorm or fallen victims to pagans. But the event that occurred on February 4th deprived them of this saving illusion, providing irrefutable evidence that a force was at work in the forest that violated the fundamental laws of biology. That day, a patrol sent to check the rabbit snares, which, of course, were empty, brought back to the fort not game, but the remains of a creature that should have been at the top of the food chain in these woods, the carcass of a large North American wolf, whose death became the subject of the strangest and most terrifying investigation in the colony's history. Percival Thorne, whose ledger had by this time become the diary of an amateur pathologist, devoted 3 pages to the description of this corpse, written in a small, cramped hand, where every word is imbued with a mixture of scientific interest and deep religious disgust. The animal's carcass, thrown onto a cutting table in a freezing warehouse, presented a grotesque riddle. A wolf that had weighed at least 100 pounds in life had been killed not by a bullet, an arrow, or a trap, but by an instantaneous and monstrous mechanical force, the nature of which Thorne tried to unravel using logic and primitive surgical instruments. The first thing that caught the quartermaster's eye was the complete absence of external damage to the skin, characteristic of a fight with another predator. There were no lacerations from the bear's claws, no bites on the throat, which rivals in the pack would leave. Death occurred because the animal's spine was broken in 3 places simultaneously, and the nature of the fractures indicated that the wolf was not struck with something heavy, but was literally twisted like a wet rag, with a force vector applied that was opposite to the anatomical structure of the skeleton. Thorne writes, "To do this to the muscles and bones of an adult carnivore requires a compressive force beyond that of any creature known to me, resembling the work of an industrial oil press, not the grip of a living creature." The real horror, however, lay not in how the wolf was killed, but in what was done to it after death. And it was these details that caused the seasoned soldiers standing around the table to cross themselves and whisper prayers as they backed toward the exit. The animal's femur, the strongest bone in the mammal skeleton, was exposed and gnawed, but the tooth marks on it did not fit any biological classification. Thorne, armed with a magnifying glass and compasses, took measurements that left him dumbfounded. The distance between the grooves on the bone indicated a jaw twice the width of a human's, but the shape of the teeth was absolutely, impossibly human. These were not the sharp fangs of a predator designed for tearing flesh, but broad, flat molars created for grinding and crushing, but enlarged to monstrous proportions. It looks as if a man had been stretched on a rack to a height of 10 feet, with the structure of his teeth intact, Thorne writes, and the phrase conveys the understanding that they were confronted with a perverse parody of themselves. Further examination revealed an even more disturbing detail. The bone marrow from the shattered femur had been sucked out with such force that a vacuum had formed inside the bone, drawing in fragments of periosteum. Thorne, being an educated man, understood the physics of the process. To extract a thick, frozen substance from a narrow channel, you need a lung capacity comparable to a blacksmith's bellows and the ability to create negative pressure that would rupture the lungs of an ordinary person. This observation supported the theory that the creature that killed the wolf had a ribcage of abnormal volume and specific diaphragm muscles adapted to this type of feeding. This was no ordinary predator. It was a specialized devourer for whom bones were merely fragile packaging for nutritious contents. And the ease with which it opened this package spoke of its colossal superiority over any organism in this forest. But the most chilling discovery Thorne recorded in the special features section was a substance found on the fur around the wound, solidified, glassy saliva that didn't melt in the warmth of the room as quickly as regular ice. When Thorne tried to scrape it off with his knife, the blade made a grating sound, like contact with stone, and when heated over a candle, the substance began to evaporate, releasing the very smell that had followed them through the forest. A mixture of ammonia, musk, and something vaguely familiar that the quartermaster could not identify for several hours. Only in the evening, sitting over the body of the torn wolf, did he realize what that smell was. It was the concentrated smell of human hunger. The smell of ketosis that comes from the mouth of a person dying of exhaustion when the body begins to digest itself. The creature that had killed the wolf smelled like the people at Jamestown, only 1,000 times stronger, as if it were an embodiment, a physical condensation of their own suffering and hunger. The colonists' reaction to the results of this impromptu dissection was predictable and catastrophic for the fort's morale. If before they had feared the savages or the Spaniards, now they realized that their enemy was beyond the understanding of military strategy. The soldiers who saw the wolf's shattered bones began to say that this was God's punishment, that God had rejected their prayers and allowed the demons of hell to rise to earth to punish them for their sins of pride. Captain Percy tried to explain what he saw by the presence of an unknown species of mutant bear in the forest, but his voice trembled, and no one believed him, because everyone saw traces of flat human teeth. This discovery triggered a cycle of religious terror. People began refusing to go out on duty, claiming that bullets were powerless against the devil, and that the only salvation was prayer and repentance. which, under conditions of strict discipline and a lack of resources, was tantamount to rebellion. Thorne, left alone with the dead wolf and his notes, came to a conclusion that was more terrifying than any superstition. He realized that the creature had not simply killed a competitor. It had committed an act of demonstrative violence, leaving the corpse in a prominent place as a warning or mockery. The method of killing did not reflect animal rage, but rather cold calculation, and even a certain playfulness characteristic of higher primates. The creature toyed with the wolf before killing it, breaking its bones one by one, enjoying its power, and this sadism indicated the presence of intelligence, perverted, alien, but certainly high. "We are not dealing with a beast," writes Thorne in the conclusion to Part 3, "but with a mind that knows the anatomy of fear better than we know the anatomy of the body. It knows we will find it. It knows we will understand. And it waits for our fear to make us tastier." From that day on, Fort Jamestown ceased to be a military installation and became a huge trap where the victims locked themselves in, awaiting the inevitable visit of the executioner. The atmosphere within the walls became toxic. People looked at each other with suspicion, looking for signs of the same transformation they had seen on the wolf's bones. Rumors that some of the colonists had begun to change, that their teeth had grown longer, and that their eyes had begun to glow in the dark, spread through the barracks like a plague. Thorne noticed that the salt supplies were beginning to disappear, not because they were being eaten, but because superstitious soldiers were scattering it on the doorsteps, hoping to stop an evil that they now knew was biological in nature, but mystical in power. And while psychosis was brewing inside the fort, outside, in the icy darkness, the creature that had tasted the wolf was preparing for a change in diet, realizing that the main course had already reached the necessary state of despair. The forensic examination of the nightmare was completed. The verdict was, there are no guilty parties. There is only food and those who eat. March 1610 began not with the arrival of spring, but with a meteorological collapse that Percival Thorne dubbed the whiteout in his notes, a phenomenon that turned Fort Jamestown into an isolated sensory deprivation chamber, cut off from the rest of the world by a wall of flying snow. If, up until this point, contact with the X factor had been characterized by targeted strikes and psychological terror, then the night of March 3rd to 4th became the point of no return, when the predator switched from the tactics of attrition to the open phase of hunting, taking advantage of the weather conditions as ideal camouflage. The storm that swept over Virginia was so thick that the sentry on the wall could not see his own outstretched hand, and the wind howling in the loopholes created an acoustic chaos in which it was impossible to distinguish human speech, the creak of footsteps, or the sound of a gun being cocked. Thorne describes this state as zero visibility, when space narrows to the radius of a flickering torch flame, and everything beyond this circle of light no longer belongs to people, but to someone who can see in the dark. The catalyst for the nightmare was a sound that cut through the roar of the storm at around 2 in the morning, a sound that by its very nature should not have existed in this icy hell, and that made the blood run cold, even in those who had already resigned themselves to death. It wasn't a wolf howl or a Powhatan war cry. It was a child's cry. The thin, shrill voice of 12-year-old drummer Nate, who had died of bloody diarrhea back in December and was buried in a mass grave outside the perimeter. The voice called for my mother, begged her to open the gate and complained about the cold. And this sound had such hypnotic authenticity that it penetrated straight into the subcortex, bypassing the logical barriers of the mind. Thorne, who was in the guardhouse at the time, records that the experienced soldiers who heard this call fell into a trance. They knew that the boy was dead. They themselves dug the frozen earth for his grave, but their ears betrayed their minds, convincing them that the child was alive and standing right outside the gate. It was the mimicry and deception strategy at its most brutal, biological, using vocal cords of incredible range to reproduce frequencies that trigger the primate's instinctive desire to protect its offspring. The tragedy unfolded when one of the guards, a young recruit whose psyche had been exhausted by months of hunger, could not withstand the pressure and, disobeying a direct order, rushed to the gate to pull back the bolt. Thorne's notes describe this moment as a breakdown of discipline, with the chain of command crumbling in the face of manipulation of base instincts. Captain Percy shouted orders to shoot anyone approaching the exit, but his voice was drowned out by the howling wind and the false cries of a dead boy. As soon as the heavy oak beam was moved just an inch, the white darkness rushed in. But along with the snow, something moved faster than the human eye could detect. It wasn't the grand entrance of a monster of legend. It was a rush of kinetic energy, like a cannonball, that sent the recruit flying back 5 yards, turning his ribcage into a pulp of bone and lungs before he even hit the ground. At this point, the fort descended into the chaos of close combat, where the advantage of firearms was reduced to 0, since matchlock muskets were useless in the blizzard and cramped conditions, and reloading took too much time, which the men did not have. Thorne describes the scene as a series of flashes and sounds plucked from the darkness. The flash of gunpowder on the pan, illuminating for a split second a grey, hairless limb longer than a man's leg, but bent at the elbow like an arm. Then a sound the quartermaster described as the wet crunch of tearing canvas. But it was not the fabric tearing, but the muscles of the sergeant's back as the creature grabbed him and lifted him into the air. The monster did not stand still. It used a vertical plane of attack, moving along the beams of the ceilings and the roofs of the barracks with the grace of a giant spider, attacking from above and disappearing before the soldiers had time to deploy their pikes. One of the most horrific scenes, recorded in the register with anatomical dispassion, was the death of a blacksmith, the strongest man in the colony, who attempted to meet the enemy with a blow from a heavy hammer. Thorne writes that the blacksmith swung, but the blow fell into empty space because the creature was moving at an unnatural speed, inaccessible to terrestrial biology. The next second, the blacksmith's head was severed from his body in one sharp movement, not cut off, but torn off with a twisting jerk, and the spinal column was pulled out of the body by a foot, as if the monster was trying to get a delicacy from the shell. The sight, illuminated by the fallen torch, sent the remaining defenders into a state of paralyzing shock. They realized that their physical strength, their armor, and their hand-to-hand combat skills were of no use against a creature that treated the human body like a fragile straw doll. The acoustics of that night were dominated not by gunshots, but by the sounds of biological decay. People weren't shouting, "Attack!" They were screaming at frequencies close to ultrasound, as their bodies were subjected to deformations incompatible with life. Thorne notes that the monster made its own sounds, a low, vibrating rumble that resonated in the survivors' chests, causing uncontrollable urination and panic. It was the sound of pleasure, the sound of a creature that had found itself in a buffet full of food and was now simply choosing the most delicious pieces. The predator didn't kill everyone. It was selective, picking off the fattest as far as possible, or youngest from the crowd, ignoring the elderly and sick, which once again confirmed its rational, almost farmer-like approach to harvesting biomass. The battle, if this massacre can be called that, lasted no more than 10 minutes. But during this time, the garrison lost 15 men. And what is most terrible is that the bodies of the dead disappeared along with the attacker. The creature didn't just kill, it took its prey with it into the night, demonstrating phenomenal strength that allowed it to run through deep snow with a 200-pound load on its shoulder or in its teeth. When the attacker retreated, disappearing into the snowstorm as suddenly as he had appeared, a silence fell over the fort that was more terrible than the noise of battle. It was the silence of realization. The survivors realized that they were no longer His Majesty's soldiers. They were cattle in a pen, and the owner was simply coming for the first batch of meat, leaving the rest to grow. Thorne's inspection of the slaughter site at dawn, after the storm had died down, revealed details that made him doubt the colony's survival at all. On the gates, which were barricaded after the attack, traces of mucus were found on the inside, which glowed a pale green in the semi-darkness. This substance, when it came into contact with the skin of one of the survivors, caused a chemical burn similar to the effects of acid, which indicated the toxicity of the monster's secretions. Moreover, there were tracks in the snow that didn't lead into the forest, but ended in the middle of the yard, as if the creature was able to jump tens of meters or move along walls, ignoring gravity. The entry in the register for March 5th ends with a conclusion that sounds like an epitaph of human arrogance. We thought that the walls protected us from the forest, but that night we realized that the walls only hindered our escape. It came to us not as an enemy storming a fortress, but as a master entering his barn. It knew our names, it knew the voices of our dead, and it laughed at us while it tore us apart. Now I know we won't survive. The only question is, in what order we will feed him. This part of Thorne's chronicle is no longer written in the calligraphic handwriting of a clerk, but in the jagged, jumping letters of a man whose hands are shaking from the adrenaline rush and the knowledge that the next night could be his last. By the end of March 1610, the concept of time in Fort Jamestown had ceased to exist as a linear quantity, giving way to an endless cycle of waiting for death in the darkness of a barricaded warehouse that had become the last stronghold of the survivors. Percival Thorne, whose notes by this point read less like quartermaster's reports and more like chronicles of a descent into hell, describes the atmosphere inside the shelter as a collective catatonic stupor, broken only by prayers and the sounds of muskets being reloaded. However, the culmination of this tragedy, which occurred on the night of March 21st, erased the line between nightmare and reality, demonstrating the complete biological superiority of the predator over man. It was not a battle, for a battle implies at least the theoretical possibility of victory for one side. It was the slaughter of cattle, carried out with an efficiency that made Thorne doubt that man is the crowning achievement of God's creation. The final act of the drama began when the heavy oak doors of the warehouse, reinforced from the inside with sacks of earth and barrels, were not knocked down by a battering ram, as the defenders expected, but were carefully removed from their hinges from the outside. The creature, possessing monstrous strength and fingers capable of crushing iron, simply tore the forged rods from the rotten wood, opening a passage into the room. The light inside the warehouse was dim, a dying fireplace and a few smouldering oil lamps, creating the perfect conditions for a visual phenomenon Thorne described as a devil's strobe. As the first soldiers instinctively pulled their triggers, muzzle flashes tore through the darkness, capturing static, jerking images of terror. In those brief, blinding moments, lasting only a fraction of a second, people saw their executioner not as a blurry shadow, but in all his anatomical disgust. And this image was forever burned into the retinas of the survivors. What entered the warehouse was a biological nightmare, perfectly adapted to the icy forest environment. It was neither a wolf nor a bear. It was a grotesque, exaggerated caricature of a man whose evolution had turned onto the path of pure predation. Thorne describes a creature about 8 feet tall, whose body was devoid of even a hint of subcutaneous fat, only tight, twisted cords of muscle beneath pale, parchment-like skin, through which a black network of veins could be seen. His limbs were unnaturally elongated, resembling the legs of a giant spider, and his joints seemed to be twisted backwards, allowing him to move with a broken, unpredictable grace. But the most terrifying thing was the head. The skull, covered with skin so tightly that the seams of the bones were visible, and the eyes, 2 deep hollows in which a cold yellow light burned, reflecting the flashes of gunshots, the tapetum lucidum effect, devoid of pupils and emotions, except for one, an endless, all-consuming hunger. The physics of the battle, which unfolded in the confined space of the warehouse, immediately demonstrated the complete ineffectiveness of the gunpowder weapons of that era against an organism whose physiology had been altered by an ancient cannibalistic virus. Thorne records with horror the moment when Captain Percy, standing in the front row, emptied his musket into the monster's chest from a distance of 3 steps. A .75 caliber lead bullet, capable of felling a horse, struck the skinny body. But instead of throwing the enemy back, it simply passed through him, sending up a fountain of black, viscous ichor. The creature didn't even slow down, its tissue, stripped of vital organs as we know them, Thorne speculates that the heart and lungs had atrophied or shifted, closed around the wound with a sickening slurp. It was the regeneration strategy at its most terrifying. The monster felt no pain because its nervous system functioned differently, perceiving damage only as the loss of a small amount of biomass that could be quickly replenished with food. In the next few minutes, the warehouse turned into a slaughterhouse, where the laws of human tactics were shattered by brute biological power. The creature moved faster than the soldiers could cock their guns or draw their swords, a blur that materialized next to its victim only to deliver the fatal blow. Thorne describes the scene of the death of one of the mercenaries who tried to pierce the monster with a halberd. The creature intercepted the shaft with its bare hand, breaking the thick wood like a match, and at the same moment struck back with its other hand. Long, obsidian knife-like claws ripped through the cuirass and the flesh beneath it, as easily as if it were wet paper, releasing the man's entrails onto the floor. The smell of fresh blood that hit his nostrils sent the monster into a frenzied rage. He no longer killed carefully. He began to tear people apart, scattering limbs and turning bodies into shapeless pieces of meat. The acoustic panorama of this massacre, as recorded by Thorne, consisted of a symphony of sounds that the human ear should not hear. The screams of the dying people turned into gurgles as their throats were torn out, and the crunch of breaking bones drowned out even the crash of falling furniture. But the most terrible sound was not the screams of the victims, but the sound of feeding itself. In the chaos of the battle, the creature managed to tear off pieces of flesh from still living people and swallow them without chewing, while emitting a low, satisfied rumbling. Thorne, huddled in a corner behind a stack of gunpowder barrels, watched as his comrades, with whom he had shared the bread and hardships of the journey, were converted into a protein mass to support the life of this arbiter of destinies. He saw the young lieutenant's head crushed under one hand like an overripe fruit, his brains splattered across the walls where hung a map of the new world. A world that turned out to be old and hungry. At the climax of this massacre, an event occurred which Thorne interpreted as the final proof of the rationality of evil. When less than a dozen people remained alive, trapped in a far corner, the monster suddenly stopped. He stood frozen in the middle of a room littered with corpses, towering over the bloody mess like a dark idol, his burning eyes sweeping over the faces of the survivors. He didn't finish them off. Instead, he walked over to the nearest corpse, slung it lightly over his shoulder, and, with a sound like metal scraping on glass, which Thorne deciphered as a twisted semblance of laughter, walked slowly out the open doors, disappearing into the night. He did not leave them alive out of mercy. Thorne realized the terrible truth. The creature had left them alive because they were breeding sows of fear, meant to tell others of its power, or, more likely, it had left them as breeding stock, so that, driven mad by hunger and terror, they would begin to eat the corpses of their comrades, completing the cycle of transformation. Finishing his description of that night, Thorne writes with a trembling hand, leaving blots on the paper. "I have seen the face of the god of this land, and he is hungry. We are not colonizers, we are not warriors. We are fodder that had the audacity to build a corral on someone else's pasture. Our bullets are like mosquito bites to him, our walls like cobwebs. Today he's had his fill, but tomorrow he'll be back. And the worst part isn't that he'll kill us. The worst part is that, looking at the torn bodies of my friends, I feel more than just grief. I smell meat. And this smell, Lord, save my soul, this smell seems sweet to me." The biological apocalypse ended not with the death of all people, but with the death of their humanity. For the Wendigo virus is not a disease of the body, but a disease of the soul, which begins with the thought that survival justifies any sin. The final pages of Percival Thorne's register, dated early April 1610, constitute a document that forensic psychiatrists and biologists who studied the artifact in the late 20th century called a chronicle of biological acceptance. If the previous entries were imbued with fear and a desperate attempt to retain a human form, then the ending of this story is written by the hand of a creature that has already crossed the invisible line separating prey from predator. Here we no longer see panic or prayers for salvation. The text becomes calm, frighteningly rational, and filled with a twisted logic that justifies cannibalism not as a necessary measure, but as an evolutionary necessity, a gift bestowed by the master of the forest to purge the colony of the weak. Thorne's handwriting changes dramatically in this section. The letters become angular and vertically stretched, as if his finger movements had undergone anatomical changes that prevented him from producing the rounded lines characteristic of 17th century calligraphy. April in Jamestown, judging by the records, brought no relief, despite the fact that the snow began to melt. The fort fell into a silence that Thorne describes as the blessed peace of satiety. No more than 30 people remained alive, but the register no longer mentions the famine. On the contrary, the quartermaster meticulously records the improvement in the physical condition of the survivors. The scurvy that had tormented them all winter had receded. Their gums had stopped bleeding, and muscle weakness had been replaced by feverish energy and heightened senses. Thorne notes that he can now hear mice scratching under the floor in the neighbouring barracks and smell blood from a mile away. He attributes this miraculous healing to the adoption of a new diet, which he calls the communion of the flesh. The text omits the names of the slain comrades. They have been transformed into faceless units of resource that must be properly stored and distributed. Thorne describes the process of salting human flesh with the same businesslike efficiency with which he had previously described the accounting of grain, adding comments on the taste qualities of various parts of the body and how the strength of the slain is transferred to the one who ate it. The author's psychological state during this period can be characterized by the biological acceptance strategy. Thorne no longer perceives the Wendigo as an enemy or a devil. In his inflamed mind, poisoned by prions and the toxins of cannibalism, the monster transformed into the figure of a shepherd or gardener who came to thin the flock and teach the survivors the true laws of nature. He writes, "We were foolish to try to fence ourselves off from the forest with walls. The forest is within us. The master showed us that there is no sin in surviving. There is only sin in being weak. Those who went to feed fulfilled their purpose. They became part of us, and now we are one. I feel them inside me. Their voices have faded away, dissolved in my hunger." This terrible confession testifies to the complete disintegration of personality and the replacement of moral norms with the imperatives of parasitic survival. The key moment of the finale is the description of the final encounter with the creature, which took place not in an atmosphere of battle, but in an atmosphere of eerie, ritualistic calm. Thorne writes that the master came to the fort at sunset, but did not break down the doors or kill. He simply sat on the roof of the warehouse, dangling his long limbs down, and watched the colonists go about their business. The survivors did not flee in panic. They emerged as if hypnotized and gazed at him in awe, some falling to their knees, holding out their hands to the monster. Thorne describes the creature as making a low, vibrating sound, like the purring of a giant cat, and that this sound resonated with the new rhythm of the colonists' hearts. It was a moment of symbiosis. The predator was convinced that his farm was functioning properly, that the hunger virus had taken hold and would sprout. He didn't take anyone that night, because he knew they weren't going anywhere. They were his now, biologically. However, Thorne's own physical transformation was progressing at an alarming rate, and this was reflected in the final paragraphs of the document. He complains that the skin on his body has become dry and tight, like parchment, and that he is constantly cold, even sitting right next to the fire, as if an internal cold was coming from his bones. He describes with amazement how his nails turned black as horn, making it difficult to hold a pen. My fingers, they became longer. I look at my hand and don't recognize it. It's not the hand of a clerk. It's the hand of someone who can reach your heart through your ribs, he writes. These lines do not convey fear, but rather a morbid curiosity, a fascination with his own transformation into something else, into the likeness of the one he now worshipped. The point of breaking the recording occurs suddenly and has a clearly expressed physiological character. The text on the last page becomes illegible. The letters jump and run into each other, turning into meaningless scratches. The ink was smeared in several places, and chemical analysis showed that the stains contained a high concentration of saliva with an abnormal enzyme composition. The last phrase that could be deciphered reads, "The hunger does not go away, it grows. I hear their call from the forest. They say that I am ready. The skin is bursting on my back. Wings? No, just bones. I have to go. The door is open. He's waiting." This is followed by a long, jagged line that tears through the paper, as if the writing instrument had been pressed hard into the sheet as a result of a spasm or cramp, when the hand had finally lost its human anatomy. Not only did the writing cease, but the author physically lost the ability to be a human being capable of written speech. The bridge built today by researchers who studied this document makes the story of Jamestown relevant to this day, transforming it from a historical anecdote into a warning. The ledger was found in a sealed lead box filled with wax, suggesting that someone, possibly subsequent expeditions that found the empty fort, deliberately buried this source of contamination, recognizing its danger. But the most frightening fact is that during excavations of the foundation in the 90s, not a single human skeleton corresponding to the described period of the Hungry Time was found. The official story says they died and were buried, but the earth remains silent. No bones, no skulls, no buttons from clothing. 400 people simply disappeared, leaving no biological trace, as if they had walked into the forest on their own 2 feet. Or they were eaten without leaving a trace, along with the bones. Modern cryptozoologists, analysing data from Thorne's registry, point to a cyclical pattern in the activity of this species of predator. According to their theory, the Wendigo is not a solitary creature, but a colonial organism or virus that has a latent period lasting approximately 400 years. If we count this period from 1610, we get a date that is frighteningly close to our time. The Jamestown area is now a popular tourist destination, surrounded by dense forests where dozens of people go missing every year, their disappearances attributed to accidents or crime. But statistics show that most of these people go missing during the cold months, and their bodies are never found. The final punchline of this story lies not in mysticism, but in the biological reality of our species. The story of Percival Thorne proves that civilization is a thin film that flies off a person after 3 weeks of starvation. We think of ourselves as the top of the food chain, building cities and launching satellites. But to the ancient predator slumbering in the Virginia forests, we are simply a rapidly reproducing biomass that is herding itself into the concrete enclosures of cities. Thorne's register ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis left by a claw on the paper. And if, while walking through an autumn forest, you suddenly smell ozone and sweetish rot, and the birds around you fall silent, don't try to run. There's no point in running when you're already in the menu. Just remember, hunger is the only constant in the universe, and sooner or later it will come for you.